Denver, Colorado. Autumn, 1888. A poor father carried his freezing infant into a general store, and the richest widow in Colorado would change his life before that day was over. No one in that store, least of all the man himself, could have guessed how far the reversal would reach, or how much it would cost the woman who caused it. The wind came through the door of the Larimer Street Mercantile ahead of him, scattering grit across floorboards worn silver by 20 years of boots. Gideon Marsh's coat was too thin for a season already turning hard toward winter. His boots had cracked open at the toe. The infant against his chest was wrapped in a blanket gone nearly to gauze, and Gideon carried him the way a man carries the last warm thing left in the world, not with the practiced ease of someone who has done this 1,000 times, but with a desperate, careful tenderness that made more than one customer glance up and quickly look away again. Done willing to hold his eye. Denver, that autumn, was a city built on other people's silver. Fortunes had risen out of the mountains faster than the streets could be paved to carry them, and for every mansion going up along Sherman Street, there were 3 shanties going up along the rail yards to house the men who had actually dug the ore out of the ground. Nobody in the fine part of the city liked to think too hard about that arrangement. Most of them managed it easily enough, most days. Near a shelf stacked with imported tea tins, a woman in dove-gray silk had gone very still. Adeline Whitfield was 44 years old and owned more of that city than most of the men currently walking its streets, a mansion, silver shares in 3 separate mining concerns, enough land to watch the Front Range change color from every window in her house. None of it had ever once kept her warm on the nights that actually mattered. 19 years had passed since she buried her only son, and the house she lived in now felt less like a home than a very large, very quiet museum built around an absence she had never quite finished grieving. Her late husband, Edward Whitfield, had built most of that fortune himself, one silver claim at a time, and had left her the whole of it when a fever took him 11 years earlier, quick and merciless, the way fevers so often were in that country. Edward had loved her in his own careful, distracted way, the way a man loves a thing he is proud to own and rarely stops to look at closely. Their marriage had been comfortable rather than tender, built more on mutual respect than on any real fire between them, and Adeline had convinced herself for years that comfort was enough, that she had already had her share of real fire and lost it the same year she buried Caleb. She had grown skilled, in the decade since, at running an estate, managing a staff, sitting through council dinners where men argued about ore tonnage as though the numbers themselves might warm the room. She had grown considerably less skilled at simply living inside her own days. Denver's fine society moved in a fairly small circle, and Adeline had long since made her peace with occupying the very center of it without ever quite belonging there. She attended what she was expected to attend. She gave what was expected of her to the church building fund and the orphan asylum twice a year, and considered her obligations discharged. It had not once occurred to her, in 11 years of careful widowhood, that a stranger's hunger might reach in and rearrange the entire shape of her life in the space of a single afternoon. She noticed Gideon because of how he held the child. She had watched a great many men in her life hold a great many things, ledgers, rifles, reins, other men's hands across negotiating tables that meant nothing to either party, and she had rarely seen anyone hold something as though it were the last thing left that hadn't yet been taken from him. She stayed back in the shadow of the dry goods aisle and watched the desperation move behind his eyes the way weather moves behind glass, plain to see if a person cared to look. Gideon crossed to the long wooden counter with his steps gone heavy and hesitant, walking the way a man walks when he is rehearsing an apology before he has even opened his mouth. Behind the counter stood Jonas Webb, spectacles pushed to the very tip of his nose, a heavy ledger open beneath both hands. Jonas valued figures a great deal more than he valued the people who produced them, and he did not look up right away. Back again, Marsh. There was no particular warmth in it, and Jonas did not lift his eyes from the column he was totaling. Gideon set a small dented tin on the counter. The label had gone soft and torn at one corner, though the words "condensed milk for infants" were still legible under the wear. "I need you to take this back." His voice had the rough, worn-through sound of a man who has not slept properly in longer than he can remember. Jonas stopped writing and pushed his glasses higher on his nose. "You took that on credit 4 days ago. I know I did." Gideon tightened his grip on the bundle in his arms. "The Silverton mine let half its crew go yesterday. I was one of them. I can't cover the balance." A short, humorless laugh. "This isn't a poorhouse, Marsh. I took a risk letting you walk out on a promise. Seal's already scratched, tin's already dented. I can't sell that back at full price to anybody now." Gideon looked down at his boots, caked in dried prairie mud that had followed him half the length of the city that morning. "Please, he needs the milk." He looked at his son. "But I need money for firewood tonight worse than I need to keep it. If I hold on to the tin, he might freeze before morning. If I return it, he might go hungry instead. I've stopped knowing which is the smaller mercy." The baby in his arms let out a thin, weak whimper, high, fragile, the kind of sound that reaches into a room and touches every person inside it, whether they want it to or not. Most of the other customers turned their faces toward the shelves instead, suddenly absorbed in flour sacks and coffee tins. Nobody much cared to look directly at the shape of somebody else's poverty. It cost them more than they wanted to pay, just to see it plainly, but Adeline was listening with her whole body now. She watched the way Gideon's hands trembled, hands calloused and scarred and stained permanently brown-gray by years of hard labor, and yet holding his son with a gentleness that seemed to belong to some other softer man entirely. It was almost too much to keep watching. No returns on opened or handled goods. Jonas closed the ledger with a hard final thud. "Take your milk and clear out. Come back when you've got real silver in your hand." Gideon stood frozen, shame radiating off him in waves. Anyone in the room could have felt. He reached for the tin with white, trembling knuckles. The baby's cry climbed louder, more desperate, a hungry wail that seemed to fill every corner of the store. Somewhere inside Adeline, a door that had been shut for 19 years opened half an inch on its hinges. Her own son, Caleb, had died of scarlet fever 3 weeks short of his 7th birthday. She could still remember the exact weight of him on the last night she held him, and the silence that followed it afterward, a silence she had never entirely learned how to live inside. She could not stand in a room and listen to another child cry, while every grown person in it looked politely the other way. Adeline stepped out from behind the shelving. The rustle of her silk was like a sudden sharp gust of its own. "Webb," her voice cut cleanly through the room, cold and certain as a blade, laid flat on a table. Jonas froze mid-motion, his hard expression melting the instant he recognized her. "Forgive me, ma'am. I hadn't seen you in the aisle. How can I help you today?" She did not look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the man in the threadbare coat. Gideon looked back at her with shock and a bone-deep weariness both at once. Taking in her fine jewelry, her carefully arranged hair, a whole world of comfort he would likely never once touch in his life, put the milk back in his bag. Jonas stared at her. "Ma'am, he can't pay the balance." "I did not ask you about his balance." She reached into a small velvet reticule and drew out a heavy gold coin, laying it on the counter with a firm ringing click. "This covers his debt in full. It also covers 7 more tins of that milk, 3 sacks of your best flour, and whatever wool blankets remain in your back room." The store went silent enough to hear the wood stove ticking in its corner. Gideon stared at the coin the way a man might stare at a fallen star lying at his own feet. "No?" He shook his head slowly. "I don't take handouts." Adeline turned to face him fully, the hardness leaving her by degrees. "This isn't charity, Mr. Marsh. It's help from one parent who understands exactly what it costs to lose a child." Her gaze moved to the infant. "Winter has no patience for anybody's pride. Tonight, your son needs warmth a great deal more than you need to owe no one a thing." Gideon looked down at his crying son, at the small fist beating uselessly against a blanket worn nearly transparent, and something in him finally gave way. A single tear cut a clean line through the dust on his cheek. "I have nothing to give you back. Then keep him safe." Her voice gentled. "And when you're able to work again, find somebody with even less than you, and do the same for them." Jonas hurried to gather the goods. Gideon, watching him work, quietly set the flour back onto its shelf. "The milk and 1 blanket will do." His eyes stayed on the counter. "I won't take more than the boy needs." Most men she had known would have swept up everything within arm's reach and expected more besides. This man, who owned almost nothing in the world, was trying instead to leave something behind on the counter. Outside, her driver Amos waited beside a polished broom, entirely unsurprised by the sight of a ragged stranger climbing in beside his mistress. He had worked for the Whitfield family long enough to recognize the particular look of a heart waking up after a very long sleep. Gideon sat stiffly on the fine cushions, afraid to lean back against them, the infant now quieted by the warmth of the cabin the way a lullaby quiets a restless child. "Gideon Marsh." He found his voice finally, watching brick buildings slide past the window. "This little one is Noah, Adeline. Tell me your story if you're willing." She learned about his wife, Ellen, who had died delivering Noah at an isolated mining camp above Leadville, the nearest doctor, 3 hard hours too far away to matter in the end, and about the small ranch he had once dreamed of building near the foothills, the gold he'd come west chasing and never once found. The years of hard labor that had given him back nothing but calluses and grief. Adeline listened with an ache spreading slowly through her chest. She saw in him a man who had already sacrificed everything he owned, and was still, daily finding new things to give up. When they reached the rail yard shanties, Adeline was horrified in a way she had not entirely expected to be, even having seen poverty from a carriage window her whole life. The houses were built out of scrap tin and old shipping crates. Wind moved freely through gaps in walls that had never truly been meant to keep anything out. Children ran barefoot across half-frozen mud. It was a landscape of people the rest of the city had simply agreed, without ever saying so out loud, to forget existed. Gideon climbed down, holding his son and the crate of goods. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. I'll find some way to repay this kindness." just keep him warm. That was the only payment she required of him. As the carriage pulled away, Adeline looked back once and saw him standing in the gray mud, a lone, stubborn figure set against a bleak and darkening sky. And she understood with sudden clarity that she could not simply leave him there to be forgotten, along with everyone else in that settlement. That evening, she crossed the long, silent hall of her own house and unlocked a door that had not been opened in 19 years. Caleb's small wooden horse still stood exactly where she had left it on the mantel. His childhood coat still hung on its peg behind the door, gathering a dust so fine it looked almost like ash settled over glass. She lifted the framed photograph from beside his little bed and studied it a long while, asking herself honestly and painfully whether some part of her was only doing this because she wanted to replace what she had lost so many years before. No, the words settled finally into the empty room. No child could ever replace you, but, loving his memory, she understood in that same breath, had never once required her to turn away from another child who needed help now. She set the photograph carefully back on the table, closed the door behind her, though she did not lock it again, and rang for Amos. She sat a long while by her own bedroom window, afterward watching the last gray light drain out of the sky over the rail yards in the distance, thinking of every child down there sleeping in a tin-walled house. Somewhere among those flickering, uneven lights was a boy no older than her own son had been, and a girl, and another boy after that, all of them growing up under roofs that would not hold against the first real winter storm. She had lived above that valley for 11 years, without once truly looking down into it, and she was ashamed, suddenly and completely, of how easy that had been to manage. By morning, she had made a decision that would shock the entire city of Denver before the week was out. She summoned her lawyer and her estate manager to the house, before breakfast had even cleared the table. "I want the old foreman's cottage on the North Ridge reopened." She did not wait for a reaction. "And I want a groundskeeper hired immediately." Her manager blinked at her over his own spectacles. "Ma'am, we haven't kept a groundskeeper in 7 years. The gardens manage well enough as they are. The gardens are cold and half dead. I want someone who understands how to make things grow again." She sent Amos back to the rail yards that same afternoon with a letter in his coat pocket. 3 hours later the carriage returned, and Gideon stepped out looking confused, faintly defensive, still wearing the same worn coat from the day before. Adeline met him on the wide stone porch. "There is a cottage on the North Hill. Stone hearth. A small garden gone to seed. It wants a man's hand to bring it back to life. The wages are fair, and milk for the boy is provided for as long as he needs it. You've already done far too much. I won't live on your land as another one of your charity cases. You will not be one. You will work for every wage you are paid, and if you fail me, then you'll dismiss me the same as any other man you'd hire." For the first time the corner of his mouth nearly lifted. "You may look the cottage over before you decide anything at all," Adeline went on. "If the work strikes you as unfair, you may walk away, owing me nothing." Gideon looked up at the great stone house behind her, then out toward the small cottage, half hidden among the pines. "Why would you do any of this for us? You don't even know me. I know what it is to be entirely alone in a house full of things, and your son deserves a warm room, a real window, and the chance to watch the sun rise over the mountains instead of through a gap in a tin wall." Gideon looked down at Noah, sleeping now in fresh blankets against his chest, and then back toward the cottage roofline one last time. "I'll work for every dollar of it." Only then did he take the keys from her open hand. The weeks that followed filled quickly with cruel whispers. The wealthy widow had taken in a gutter tramp. The ladies of the Tabor Street social circle traded the story back and forth over their tea, their voices pitched just low enough to seem discreet. She had clearly lost whatever sense she'd had left. A man like that would rob her blind before the spring thaw came. It was several of them agreed with great satisfaction, an outright scandal to keep him on her own property at all, and, worse still, to be seen walking to his door in daylight. A woman named Beatrice Colby, the unofficial head of that particular circle, and a woman who had once campaigned quietly against Adeline's marriage to Edward on grounds of insufficient family, took it upon herself to call at the mansion directly one gray afternoon, though the fundraiser occupied perhaps 2 of the 20 minutes she stayed. "People are talking, Adeline." Beatrice set down her teacup with a precise little click against its saucer. A widow living so close to a hired laborer, it invites exactly the sort of speculation a woman in your position cannot afford. A woman in my position can afford a great deal, Beatrice. That has always been rather the point of it. You know what I mean. I know precisely what you mean, and I've decided I no longer care to arrange my life around it. Adeline poured more tea into a cup that did not need refilling, mostly to give her hands something honest to do. Gideon Marsh has done more for that boy of his in one winter than half the husbands in this city manage for their own children in a decade. If that scandalizes the Tabor Street circle, I expect the circle will survive the shock. Beatrice left without finishing her tea, and word of the exchange traveled through Denver's parlors within 2 days, gaining a little more outrage with every retelling, the way such stories always did. Adeline paid none of it any mind whatsoever. She found herself walking to the cottage most afternoons, the walk itself clearing her head in a way nothing inside her own mansion ever had. She brought small carved toys for Noah. She brought leather-bound books for Gideon, who read by lamplight after his son had finally gone quiet for the night. She watched him mend the split-rail fence with steady, rhythmic strikes of a borrowed hammer, watched the color slowly return to a face that had gone gray with exhaustion the day she'd first met him in that store. Through that first month, Gideon accepted nothing beyond his agreed wages. When Adeline left a basket of food at his door, he returned half of it the very next morning, without comment. When Amos overpaid him by $1 in error, Gideon walked back through the snow that same evening to hand it over rather than keep it. He repaired the fence line, cleared the frozen well, restored the neglected orchard without ever once being prompted to do any of it. Adeline had spent years surrounded by men who praised her fortune while quietly calculating what portion of it they might one day claim for themselves. Gideon never once wondered aloud what she owned. He only ever wanted to know what needed doing next. She had not forgotten what she had seen from the carriage window that first afternoon either. In the weeks after Gideon and Noah settled into the cottage, Adeline quietly began riding out to the rail yards herself, without Amos, without any announcement to the ladies of Tabor Street, to look properly at the ground near the depot where a schoolhouse might one day stand. She met with the foreman named Dolan about wages and shift hours. She sat with 2 rail worker mothers who eyed her fine coat with open suspicion until she put plain questions to them about their children. She kept a small notebook of what she learned and shared it with almost no one, not even Gideon. Not yet. It was still only an idea then, a shape without a name, something she turned over in her mind the way Gideon turned the heart-shaped stones he found in his garden. One frost-bright morning, Adeline brought Noah a small rattle carved in the shape of a horse and stayed to watch Gideon split firewood for the coming cold. Noah, propped in a nest of blankets on the porch, watched his father's steady swing with wide, solemn eyes, and Adeline found herself laughing, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had not heard come out of her own mouth in longer than she could easily remember. Gideon set down the axe and simply looked at her for a moment, as though the sound itself had surprised him more than it had surprised her. "You should do that more often." His voice was quiet. "Do what? Laugh like you mean it." She had no answer ready for that, and so she only smiled and busied herself with the baby's blankets instead, feeling something warm and unfamiliar settle low in her chest. If a story like this one is moving you, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a member. It takes 30 seconds and keeps stories like theirs alive. One evening in early winter, the season's first real snow began to fall, soft and heavy as feathers dropping out of a still gray sky. Adeline stayed late at the cottage that night, sitting with Gideon by the small hearth fire. The room was tiny compared to the ballroom inside her own house, but it held a warmth her mansion had never once managed to hold on to in 19 years of trying. "I found this in the garden today." Gideon pressed a smooth river stone into her palm, worn by water, and time into the near-perfect shape of a small heart. "I used to find these for Ellen. I wanted you to have this one instead." Adeline turned the stone over in her fingers, her skin brushing briefly against the rough calluses of his hand, and felt something she had not let herself feel in a very long while. A small, unguarded spark of simply. It was no longer only about charity between them, and had not been, if she was honest with herself, for several weeks already. That realization frightened her more than she wanted to admit, even in the privacy of her own head. She had loved a husband once. She had buried a son. She had survived both losses by locking every tender part of herself carefully away where nothing could reach in and take it from her a second time. What if Gideon saw nothing in her but her fortune, the way so many men before him had over the years? Worse still, what if she was only using Noah to fill the exact shape Caleb had left behind him in that empty room down the hall? She closed her fingers around the little stone heart and kept the rest of it to herself. For the first time in 19 years, she had something in her life she was genuinely afraid of losing again. The world outside her gates had no particular interest in her happiness, however carefully she guarded it. A handful of days later, a group of men arrived at Adeline's wrought iron gate like a small, well-dressed army arriving for an inspection. At their head walked Cornelius Ashford, a town councilman who had spent the better part of 30 years despising Adeline's late husband, Edward, over some old dispute involving a silver claim neither man had ever fully let go of, and who had apparently transferred every last ounce of that bitterness directly onto her the moment Edward was safely in the ground. The dispute as it happened went back to a survey filed in the same season both men had staked claims along the same ridge above Central City, years before either of their fortunes had fully taken shape. Edward's claim had proven the richer of the two by a wide margin, and Cornelius had never once let the matter rest, not through Edward's decade of quiet success nor through the funeral itself, where he had stood at the very back of the church wearing an expression. He had spent the year since building his own considerable standing on the town council. and he had watched Adeline's ongoing independence, a widow running an estate without a man's name attached to any of it, with the particular irritation of someone who believed the world owed him a correction it had never once delivered. Mrs. Whitfield Cornelius wore the cold, rehearsed smile of a man who has practiced looking reasonable in a mirror. There have been complaints regarding your new hired man. He aired his grievances out of turn at a miners' meeting in Leadville before he was let go from the Silverton operation. Certain investors are naming him an agitator now, and worse. Adeline glanced once toward the distant cottage chimney, smoke rising steady and gray against the white winter sky. Was he charged with any crime at all? No. Then you've brought me gossip, Cornelius, not evidence? She held her ground squarely on the marble steps. He is my employee, and my guest on this land. He has done nothing on this property but work harder than any man I have ever hired in my life, and he cares for his own child with more honor than you have shown to anyone in yours. The North Ridge parcel was surveyed under an older filing. Cornelius pressed on, undeterred. My attorneys believe the old boundary line can be challenged in open court. If you insist on sheltering this man, I will see every transfer connected to that land frozen before the month is out, and your silver shares along with it. It was a direct threat, aimed squarely at the whole of her fortune, and Adeline felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the mountain wind at her back. She knew precisely what Cornelius actually wanted. He had circled her silver claims like a patient vulture for years, already waiting for exactly this kind of opening to present itself. That night, she described the visit to Gideon, trying and failing to keep the fear entirely out of her own voice. Gideon, who understood the particular weight of a real threat better than most men ever would. I should leave tonight. His voice was flat with old familiar pain. I've already brought you enough trouble for one lifetime. I'll take Noah and find work further south before the weather closes the passes. Adeline reached for his hand across the small table between them. If you leave now, the bullies win outright, and your son goes right back into the cold where I found him. I won't allow that to happen to him or to you. What about your own money, Adeline? What about your standing in this whole town? My money has bought me nothing but walls around a very large, very empty house. And my standing is built on shadows and ghosts I stopped believing in years before I ever met you. I would rather lose every last bit of their approval than abandon what I know to be right. My wealth has protected me from hardship, Gideon. It has never once protected me from being entirely alone. It was a bold thing for any woman to declare aloud in 1888. In those days, a woman's reputation was often the only currency she was permitted to hold in her own name outright, and defending a poor laborer against the most powerful men in Denver risked unmaking that currency entirely, overnight, without appeal. But Adeline Whitfield had grown tired in her own quiet and stubborn way of playing by rules that had never once been written with her own happiness in mind. By morning, she had made her decision. She did not call her lawyer to fight Cornelius quietly behind closed doors, the way her husband always would have. Instead, she sent word calling for a public meeting at the Courthouse Square, open to anyone in the city who cared to attend. Snow had begun falling again by the time Adeline stood on the courthouse platform. A large crowd gathered below her in the biting cold, curious and more than a little judgmental in their whispering. Cornelius stood near the front with a smug, expectant look already settling comfortably onto his face, certain of how the morning would end. I have an announcement. Adeline's voice carried easily across the whole square. I have signed a protected 6-year lease on the North Ridge Cottage to Gideon Marsh. If he fulfills the terms of the work agreement and continues improving the land as promised, he will hold the legal right to purchase that homestead outright for $2. The agreement has already been signed, witnessed, and recorded with the county clerk this very morning. Gideon had not known about the purchase clause beforehand, and his face tightened, not with greed, but with the old familiar fear of receiving far more than he believed he had rightly earned. Adeline caught his eye across the crowd and gave the smallest shake of her head. Not a gift, the gesture seemed to say plainly enough. A future you will build with your own 2 hands, the way you've built everything else. And I am investing my own silver shares, she went on, into a new nursery and school for this city, built for the children of the rail workers who keep this whole town running, while the rest of us forget, most days. The crowd drew one sharp collective breath together. This was no longer a private scandal traded discreetly over tea in somebody's parlor. It was something closer to a small revolution playing out in the open square, in front of everyone who cared to watch it happen. Adeline was handing a piece of her own power directly to the people standing at the very bottom of the city she had lived above for so long. Cornelius's face went a deep, furious shade of red. "You cannot do that." His voice cracked, rising up from the mud below the platform. "Those shares are tied to the Whitfield name, and to this council's approval, whether you like it or not. They are mine, to spend as I see fit." Adeline's voice never once wavered. "And if you insist on challenging this agreement in open court, you will have to explain to every person standing in this square exactly why a lawful employee and his infant son frighten you quite so badly." She stepped down from the platform. The crowd parted around her, the way still water parts around a stone dropped into it. She walked straight to her waiting carriage, where Gideon stood holding Noah against the cold. "Is it finally done?" His voice was quiet, once she was close enough to hear him over the wind. "No, it's only just beginning." The victory, as it turned out, carried a heavy price close behind it. Her name vanished quietly from every guest list in the city, one at a time, as though by some unspoken agreement. 2 banks withdrew their support from the new school project without a word of explanation. 3 merchants canceled long-standing contracts with the Whitfield estate the same week. Anonymous letters began arriving at her door, warning her in careful, unsigned hands to send Gideon away before she lost everything her late husband had spent his whole life building. For several nights running, Adeline sat alone in her study with those letters spread across the desk in front of her, wondering more than once whether courage and foolishness were separated by nothing more than a single misstep taken in the wrong direction. And yet each morning she looked toward the cottage chimney on the ridge, and as long as smoke still rose steadily from it, she knew Noah was warm, and that alone was enough to carry her forward into whatever the next difficult day happened to bring. Not everyone in Denver turned their back on her that winter, either whatever the Tabor Street circle preferred to believe. The rail yard families she had quietly visited that autumn began leaving small tokens at her gate: a jar of preserves, a carved whistle for Noah, a hand-stitched square of cloth meant for nothing in particular except gratitude. A woman named Margaret Kowalski, whose own 3 children stood to attend the new nursery school once the ground was cleared, walked all the way up from the rail yards one bitter afternoon, just to stand at the gate and tell Adeline plainly and without any polish to the words at all, that her family had never once had anybody with real money look at them and see people instead of a problem to be managed. Adeline thought about that visit more than she thought about any of Beatrice Colby's letters combined. If you believe people can still surprise you with real kindness, become a channel member and tab join beside our name. It helps keep stories like this alive. Her mansion, once merely large, now felt genuinely too vast and far too empty to bear most evenings. She began spending most of her waking hours at the cottage instead of at home. She helped Gideon plant a small winter garden along the south wall. Together, they built a modest, glass-paned greenhouse against the cottage's warmest side. She learned clumsily at first, and then with growing confidence, how to wash heavy clothes by hand in a cold basin, how to soothe a teething, cranky Noah awake at 2 a.m. without waking half the ridge. Gideon, for his part, made his own quiet sacrifice in return. He understood exactly how much she missed the fine things of her old life, even though she never once complained of the loss aloud. And so he spent his nights carving her a vanity table from solid oak gathered off the mountainside, shaping every joint and curve by hand until it was finer, in its own rough way, than anything ever shipped over from Europe. He worked at it late into the night by a single lamp, wanting more than almost anything to prove himself worthy of everything she had already given him without asking for a thing in return. The greatest test of all, though, was still ahead of them both. In the deep cold of January, one of the fiercest storms Denver had seen in years came down hard and fast out of the mountains with almost no warning at all. By nightfall, the temperature had fallen far below freezing. Snow buried the roads, erased the fence lines entirely, and piled itself into towering drifts against every wall in the city, old and new alike. Inside the mansion, Adeline sat alone by her own fire, listening to the house groan under the weight of the wind, terrified for the small cottage up on the ridge. Its stone walls were thick enough, she reminded herself, but its roof was old, and she knew it better than anyone. She had sent Amos down to check on the cottage twice already that evening before the drifts made the road impassable even for him, and both times he had returned reporting smoke from the chimney and lamplight in the window. Everything ordinary. She tried to convince herself that was enough to go to bed on. It was not enough. She sat up instead, wrapped in a shawl that had once belonged to her mother, watching the black windows rattle in their frames and listening for a sound she could not have named even to herself. Then came a sudden frantic pounding at the servant's door. She ran to it and threw it open with both hands. It was Gideon, coated in a thick shell of ice from head to boot, his face gone a ghastly shade of blue, gasping for air too cold to properly draw into his own lungs. The roof came down, he choked out between breaths. The weight of the snow was too much for the old timbers to hold. "Where is Noah?" Adeline screamed the question into the wind before he could even finish. "I wrapped him in every blanket we own and put him down in the old root cellar." Gideon fought hard for breath. "The cellar still holds some warmth under the frozen ground. I packed straw in around him, wedged the milk crate in beside him to shield him from any falling beams overhead. But a fallen roof timber is blocking the cellar door now, and I cannot shift it alone." Not in this wind. Adeline grabbed her fur cloak without a second's hesitation. The household staff had already retreated to the mansion's lower rooms for the night, and there was no time left to gather anyone else to help. She and Gideon stepped together into the white roar of the storm, the wind nearly knocking them both flat within the first 10 steps. Gideon tore off his own outer coat and wrapped it hard around her shoulders before she could refuse it. "You'll need this. So will you." He wrapped it tighter around her shoulders anyway. And I refused to lose another person to the cold tonight, of all nights. They struggled up the ridge on their hands and knees, half blind in the driving snow, unable to see more than an arm's length ahead of themselves. When they finally reached the cottage, it had become an outright ruin. The whole center of the roof collapsed inward, snow blowing freely through the broken timber overhead, the trapdoor to the cellar buried somewhere under a heap of fallen boards. Noah, the name, tore loose out of Gideon as he dug down into the wreckage. A faint, thin cry rose back at them from somewhere beneath the boards. Together, they cleared the wreckage with hands gone entirely numb from the cold, working in grim, wordless silence until Gideon finally heaved the largest fallen oak beam off the pile with a raw, desperate strength that seemed to come from somewhere well beyond his own body's limits. Adeline reached down through the opening and found the wool blanket first, then Noah himself underneath it, cold, frightened, crying weakly, but entirely alive. The milk crate and blankets from that very first day at the mercantile. They huddled together in the wreckage while the storm raged on around them like something alive and furious. Gideon wrapped both arms around Adeline and the baby together, using his own body as a shield against the driving ice. "We have to get back to the house." His mouth was close against her hair. "I can't feel my legs anymore." Adeline's voice was barely audible over the wind. "You have to move anyway." Gideon pulled her upright by main force. "You have to move for him, Adeline, do you hear me?" He tucked Noah securely beneath his own coat, then pulled Adeline's arm hard across his shoulders and hauled her upright onto her feet. Step by agonizing step, they moved together back through the storm toward the distant lights of the mansion. When her knees finally gave out entirely beneath her, Gideon simply carried her the rest of the way himself, stumbling twice into deep drifts and rising back onto his feet both times, without a single word of complaint escaping him. When they finally burst through the mansion doors together, they collapsed onto the rug of the great hall in a tangled heap. Adeline managed to stir the dying fire back to life before her own strength gave out completely, and they lay there afterward, shivering, spent, and entirely, gratefully alive. As dawn broke over a world gone white and silent, it was not the same kind of silence Adeline had lived inside for the last 19 years of her life. She opened her eyes and found Gideon beside the fire, Noah asleep at last against his chest, his free hand still wrapped tightly around her own. "You stayed." The words barely carried. Gideon looked at her as though the answer had always been the simplest thing in the entire world. "So did you." Within the year that followed, Adeline sold the Sherman Street mansion outright and moved into a smaller house on the North Ridge, keeping back just enough of her silver holdings to fund the new rail workers' school and rebuild the cottage into a proper ranch house standing behind it. Gideon did not ask her to marry him right away. Even so, he waited until the young orchard bore its very first fruit, and until he had fully honored every last term of their original work agreement to the letter. On the evening he finally signed the completed homestead deed at the county clerk's office, he pressed the small, heart-shaped stone back into her open palm once more. "The first time I gave you this, I had nothing else in the world left to offer you, and now I have a home, a son, and a whole life I want to spend sharing with you, if you'll still have a man like me." Adeline closed her hand slowly around the stone. You had all of that before, Gideon. You only ever needed somebody willing enough to see it clearly. They were married beneath the young orchard trees the following spring, with Noah asleep in Amos's arms through the entire ceremony, and not a single member of the Tabor Street social circle in attendance to witness it. Adeline found, rather to her own surprise, that she did not miss them in the slightest. She was no longer the wealthiest widow in all of Colorado. She was simply Adeline, a woman who had found a family inside a winter storm and had chosen, deliberately, to keep it close for good. The rail workers' nursery and school opened its doors the following autumn on a plot of land Adeline had chosen herself, close enough to the depot that mothers coming off the early shift could walk their children there without losing half a morning's wage to the distance. Margaret Kowalski's 3 children were among the first through its door, and within 2 years the little schoolhouse had grown a second room to hold all the families who wanted a place in it. Adeline visited every spring for the rest of her life, and she never once revealed to anyone there who had first put the idea of it into her head, though Gideon always suspected it had started in some quiet way the day she watched him hold his own hungry son inside a general store. Gideon became a respected rancher in the years that followed their wedding, his steady, patient work slowly turning dry ridge land into wide green pasture. Noah grew up tall and capable, a genuine child of the frontier in every sense of the word his father could have wished for him. They lived a simple, unhurried life together in the mountain air, far removed from the polished halls that had once made up Adeline's whole world without ever truly feeling like home. And they would never again be counted among the wealthiest families anywhere in Colorado. But in every way that actually mattered to either of them, they had quietly become the richest family in the whole territory. Rich in warmth, in honest work, in easy laughter, in someone waiting at the door at the close of every hard day. Adeline came to understand, slowly and then all at once, that true wealth was never what a person managed to keep locked away behind walls. It was only ever what they were willing, in the end, to share with somebody else. Many years later, Noah visited the old Larimer Street Mercantile with a son of his own in tow, the store much the same as it had always been, the same wood stove still ticking quietly away in its corner beside the counter. Near that same stove, Adeline and Gideon sat side by side, gray-haired now, their hands resting together between them on the bench like they had rested there 1,000 times before. Noah's boy pointed toward a small, dented tin displayed above the counter, kept there for reasons he did not yet understand at his young age. "Why does grandfather keep that old thing?" Gideon smiled at him, the same slow smile that had once nearly broken through on a frozen afternoon almost 40 years before, in this very room. "It started with a returned tin of milk," the old man began, "and it ended with an entirely new life I never once expected to get to live." Adeline rested her head against his shoulder, the way she had rested it against him countless evenings since that storm. On the mantel of their own small ranch house, beside that same dented tin, sat a smooth river stone worn into the shape of a heart. Loving Gideon, again, had never once erased her son Caleb from her life or her memory. It had simply allowed his memory, over time, to grow into something larger than grief alone had ever managed to hold by itself. She had learned, in the end, that love was the only true inheritance worth leaving behind for anybody who came after her. If this story found its way into your heart tonight, tell us in the comments which single moment stayed with you the longest: the returned tin of milk, the heart-shaped stone, or the long night of the storm. Like this video, subscribe for more stories exactly like it, and share it with somebody who still believes an ordinary kindness can change an entire life for good. In our next story, a frontier schoolteacher risks absolutely everything she has to protect a town that once turned her away at its own gates, carrying a secret nobody there. Until then, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep the true spirit of the old American West alive.